Dim the lights. Let the room grow quiet. We're drifting back to marble halls and oil lamps, where the air smelled faintly of wine, incense, and expensive deceit. Rome. A city that loved order, but secretly worshipped chaos. Its senators argued about virtue by day, and poisoned their relatives by night. Among its women wives, empresses, and mistresses power was both perfume and poison. They lived behind curtains of silk and smoke, adored in public, feared in private, and remembered for all the wrong reasons. So, let us begin gently with women whose names were whispered like omens. The ones whose beauty was dangerous, whose loyalty was flexible, and whose endings were never graceful. Let us start with Livia Drusilla. Livia was born in 58 BC. She grew up in a Rome that was already cracking from ambition. Her father was an old-fashioned aristocrat. Her first husband was a decent man. But Livia had that Roman gift for quietly choosing the winning side. When she met Octavian, the man who would later call himself Augustus, she was already married and pregnant. Rome pretended to be scandalized. But when Octavian wanted something, he simply took it, with a senator's smile. Her husband was politely divorced, the baby was born, and Livia married the future emperor. She would stand beside Augustus for more than 50 years, calm, quiet, and watching. Historians later described her as poised, elegant, and dangerously reasonable. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. It's said she preferred to work through suggestion. A word here. A question there. A husband's cough that lasted a little too long. Some suspected she poisoned her rivals and perhaps even Augustus himself, but no one could prove it. Livia was not the type to leave stains on her hands. When Augustus died, his will named her as the mother of the state. It was the highest honor Rome could offer. But behind the title was something colder, a woman who had outlived everyone she needed to, including love itself. Let us float over to another royal disaster. Her name was Messalina. And she was everything Livia pretended not to be. Messalina was young, beautiful, and catastrophically bored. She married Emperor Claudius, a man twice her age, slow to speak, and fond of paperwork. He loved her in his dull, awkward way. She loved Rome, attention, and very likely herself. The gossip says she held secret contests in the palace brothel to see how many men she could outlast in a night. Modern historians think that's probably an exaggeration. But then again, this was Rome. Exaggeration was practically a civic duty. Messalina's problem wasn't her appetite. It was her ambition. She wanted more than jewels and whispers, she wanted power. So she arranged a public wedding to her lover, while her husband was still emperor. A bold, theatrical move. Almost impressive, in a suicidal way. Claudius, slow but not stupid, eventually noticed. She was executed quietly, in a garden. Her death didn't make Rome any more virtuous, it only gave its gossip another name to savor. Now, glide with me a little further. We arrive at Agrippina, the younger daughter of one emperor, sister of another, and mother to one more. Her life was an endless balancing act between affection and survival. Agrippina's childhood was marked by exile and return. Her father, Germanicus, was adored by the people but died mysteriously, some said poisoned. Her mother was banished. Her brothers murdered. And through it all, Agrippina learned one lesson: in Rome, love was a weapon, not a refuge. She married 3 times. Each marriage was a step higher on the staircase of power. By the time she became the wife of Emperor Claudius, she was both admired and feared, a combination that often meant you had about 5 years left to live. Agrippina's son, Nero, was her masterpiece and her undoing. She helped him take the throne, and for a time, ruled through him. But power shared is power slipping. And Nero grew tired of being his mother's puppet. At first, he tried subtle ways to kill her: collapsing roofs, sabotaged boats. Agrippina survived them all, calmly adjusting her hair afterward. Eventually, Nero sent assassins. Her final words were said to be, "Strike my womb," a poetic gesture inviting the blade to the place that had created him. It's grim, but in a strangely Roman way, also theatrical. For them, life and performance were never separate things. Let us move softly to another empress one Rome preferred to forget. Julia Domna. She came from Syria, far from the old Roman families. Intelligent, cultured, serene, she was married to Emperor Septimius Severus, a man who actually seemed to love her. That was rare. Their marriage looked almost modern until you noticed the bodies piling up around it. Julia's 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, were supposed to share the empire. They didn't. Caracalla murdered his brother in their mother's arms. The blood soaked her clothes, but she didn't scream. She simply carried on, hosting philosophers and managing state letters, all while her surviving son turned into one of Rome's most hated emperors. When Caracalla was finally killed, Julia didn't bother pretending life was worth the effort. She starved herself to death. Quietly, elegantly, like a candle going out in an empty room. We could end here, but there's always one more corner of Rome's marble labyrinth to visit. One more woman waiting to be misremembered. Let us drift toward Poppaea Sabina, Nero's second wife. Famous for her beauty, infamous for everything else. Poppaea was charming in the way a cobra is elegant. She began as someone's wife, then became Nero's obsession. To marry her, he killed his first wife, possibly on a whim. Poppaea rewarded this devotion with the same faithfulness Rome always gave its rulers, temporary and selfing. She bathed in milk, so they said. Slept in silk. Whispered advice that ruined men. Her end came, ironically, through Nero himself. An argument, a kick, and she was gone. History says he wept afterward, built her a golden tomb, and married another woman who looked exactly like her. Some say he even found a young boy, dressed him as Poppaea, and kept him as a replacement. In Rome, grief was never simple. And so we drift away from these corridors of polished cruelty. The women of Rome, intelligent, cruel, charming, tragic, existed in a world where love and ambition were indistinguishable. Each tried to survive the empire's most dangerous battlefield, the palace. Some succeeded for a while. Most did not. But in their failures, they left behind the most enduring empire of all, the empire of rumor. Now, close your eyes. Imagine the flicker of a single oil lamp. The marble floor cool beneath bare feet. And the faint echo of their voices, half prayer, half confession, fading into the stillness of time. Settle in again. The air grows cooler. Marble turns to mosaic. We have drifted east to Constantinople, the city of gold domes and whispered sins. Byzantium was Rome's second life. It had the same ambitions, but softer voices. Its rulers wrapped their politics in silk and incense. And its women, oh, they learned to smile through bloodlines and betrayals that would make even Rome blush. Let us begin, gently, with the woman who rose from the stage to the throne. Theodora. Theodora was born poor. Her father kept bears for the circus. Her mother sold bread to the spectators. By the time she was 16, she was performing in shows that Rome's historians called indecent, which, from Byzantine standards, meant the audience was enjoying themselves. But Theodora was clever. She learned that in a world ruled by emperors, the greatest weapon wasn't beauty, it was endurance. When she met Justinian, he was a bureaucrat with big dreams and very little hair. He saw in her something the empire had forgotten, a survivor. When he became emperor, he made her empress. The senators were horrified. A circus girl on the throne, unthinkable. But Justinian adored her, and Theodora discovered that scandal loses power once you stop apologizing for it. As empress, she was poised and merciless in equal measure. She pushed for laws that protected women, for reasons both noble and personal. She was also known to dispose of enemies with a calm that frightened generals. When rebels filled the city, Justinian wanted to flee. Theodora didn't blink. She said, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." He stayed. They won. And she became a legend, half saint, half serpent. Let us float over to another imperial marriage, a few centuries later. Zoe Porphyrogenita. Her name meant born in the purple, a phrase reserved for children born to reigning emperors. Zoe took that quite literally. She never let anyone forget it. She ruled in the 11th century, when Byzantium was rich, paranoid, and slightly bored. Zoe loved perfumes, jewels, and younger men. The empire was secondary. She married 3 emperors, sometimes out of affection, sometimes out of boredom, often out of convenience. Her first husband was mild and dull. She poisoned him allegedly, but convincingly. Her second husband was passionate but fragile. He died mysteriously one night, leaving Zoe a widow again. The third was chosen by politics, not love. He lasted, mostly because he never disagreed with her. Zoe spent her later years mixing lotions in her private chambers, believing she could distill eternal youth. When she died, the empire barely noticed. But her jars of homemade cosmetics remained small alchemical monuments to vanity. And then there was Irene of Athens. Beautiful, devout, and entirely incompatible with mercy. She began as a royal bride, silent and observant. Her husband died early, leaving her as regent for their young son, Constantine VI. At first, she seemed the perfect mother, elegant, gentle, devoted. But devotion has many flavors. As her son grew older, he wanted to rule. Irene disagreed. So she had him blinded, ensuring he would never see the throne or anything else again. The act shocked the empire, but she remained calm, speaking softly about duty and divine order. She ruled alone for 5 years, the first woman to call herself Emperor of the Romans. Not Empress. Emperor. As if to remind everyone she had taken not just her son's sight, but his title. Her reign ended quietly. No mobs, no rebellions. Just whispers that God had finally looked away. Let us drift now, past the palaces and perfumed courtyards, toward another life that bloomed and withered in the same golden cage. Anna Kamine. A princess, a scholar, and a chronicler of everyone's failings but her own. She grew up surrounded by tutors, scrolls, and the endless rustle of servants who bowed before her. Her father, Emperor-elect Shadowy, adored her. Her mother, Irene Dokina, taught her how to survive men who didn't. Anna's education was legendary. She read Aristotle before she could walk properly, or so she claimed later. She married a nobleman, raised children, and quietly plotted to take the throne when her father died. But her brother got there first. Anna tried to overthrow him. It failed, politely. She was sent to a convent, not in disgrace, but in quiet removal. There, surrounded by candlelight and echoing halls, she wrote the Alexiad, a massive history of her father's reign. It was part scholarship, part therapy, and entirely selfing. Anna portrayed herself as wise, loyal, and tragically misunderstood. In truth, she was a woman who couldn't accept the simple unfairness of being born brilliant in the wrong century. Still, her book survived. And in a small, ironic way, so did she. We'll pause here, at the edge of another century. The Byzantines loved their contradictions, saints who sinned, queens who ruled gently and killed decisively. They turned history into a mirror of the human condition, reflective, cracked, and softly glittering. As we fade from the mosaics and incense smoke, one truth lingers like the scent of myrrh. Power doesn't corrupt suddenly. It erodes elegantly, quietly, like gold leaf worn down by the touch of too many hands. Take a slow breath. The scent of incense fades, and the marble turns cold again. Our journey drifts north out of the golden light of Byzantium, into the damp corridors of medieval Europe. Here, crowns were heavier, love was a rumor, and every marriage was a political experiment in suffering. Queens were symbols before they were people trapped in castles, wrapped in fabric, and smothered by expectations. Their portraits smile, but the stories behind them do not. Let us begin with one who tried to rule love the way men ruled kingdoms. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was clever before it was fashionable. Born in the 12th century, she inherited one of the richest regions in France. That alone made her dangerous. She first married Louis VII, the King of France, a man who looked perpetually confused by his own crown. He wanted piety. She wanted poetry, travel, and a slightly better husband. Louis took her on a crusade to the Holy Land, hoping shared holiness would fix their marriage. It didn't. He prayed, she complained. She rode at the front of the army, scandalizing the priests by wearing armor. When they returned, she asked for an annulment, citing consanguinity, a polite medieval way of saying we're technically cousins and I'm tired of you. Soon after, she married Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. It was a passionate, dangerous match. They had 8 children, half of whom rebelled against their father, often with Eleanor's secret blessing. Henry imprisoned her for 16 years. She survived. When he died, she walked free, calm, composed, and still politically terrifying. She outlived 2 kings, orchestrated royal marriages, and died peacefully at 82. For a medieval queen, that was practically immortality. Let us float gently onward to a woman who wasn't quite so lucky. Isabella of France. She was called the she-wolf of France, though her real story is less feral, more tragic. She married Edward II of England at the age of 12. He was tall, handsome, and completely uninterested in her. Edward's heart belonged to his favorite, Piers Gaveston, a man who wore silk robes and jewels better than the Queen herself. Court life became a quiet humiliation. Edward ignored Isabella at banquets. He gave Gaveston her jewels. When nobles finally killed the favorite, Isabella must have felt something between grief and relief. But her troubles weren't over. Edward found new companions, the Despencer family, and the Queen was sidelined once again. Eventually, she fled to France, gathered an army, and returned to England with her lover, Roger Mortimer. They deposed Edward. Then, he died mysteriously in prison. People whispered that Isabella had him killed in grotesque ways. That's unlikely. But she didn't deny it either. Silence was power, and she wielded it gracefully. For a few years, she ruled through her son, until he grew old enough to turn on her, repeating the same cold pattern of medieval parenthood. She died quietly in a convent, surrounded by candles, holding the rosary she never quite believed in. Now, let us drift further north, into colder rooms and stranger marriages. Margaret of Denmark, Queen of Scotland. She was married off to King James III at the age of 13. Her dowry included the Orkney Islands, which is one way to say welcome to the family. James was distant, suspicious, and more interested in collecting coins than affection. Margaret spent her youth smiling for portraits and enduring gossip about her husband's odd behavior. He was said to prefer the company of musicians and goldsmiths, men who admired his treasures but not his crown. She had 3 sons. After the third, she simply stopped smiling. Her health declined, slowly but politely, as if she didn't want to inconvenience anyone by dying too soon. She passed away in her 20s, leaving James to continue his lonely reign. He built her a beautiful tomb. Guilt often inspires fine architecture. Let us move south again to Castile, to the endless echo of stone courtyards and the weary rhythm of royal duty. Joanna of Castile, better known by the name history gave her, Juana la Loca. Joanna the Mad. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who united Spain and expelled almost everyone who didn't fit their vision. Joanna inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's political cunning. Unfortunately, she also inherited their disregard for happiness. She married Philip of Burgundy, young, handsome, and proud. They loved each other intensely, but unevenly. Philip's infidelity broke her, and her emotional storms made him mock her. It was a marriage that rotted from passion into paranoia. When Philip died suddenly, perhaps poisoned, perhaps not, Joanna refused to let go. She traveled across Spain with his coffin, opening it occasionally just to make sure he was still dead. She slept beside it at night. The court whispered. Her father quietly declared her insane and locked her away for the rest of her life. She lived 46 more years. Never executed. Never free. Just a ghost in her own palace, remembered mostly for her grief. One more, before we rest. Anne of Brittany. A small, graceful figure forever surrounded by politics too large for her. She married not one but 2 French kings, Charles VIII and Louis XII, because her duchy, Brittany, was too valuable to remain independent. Her first husband died from walking into a doorframe, a truly French accident. Anne remarried for diplomacy, not affection. She bore child after child, losing most of them before they could speak. By her 30s, she was exhausted, devout, and done pretending. Her diaries mention prayers, embroidery, and a longing for quiet, a rare thing in palaces built on noise. When she died, her heart was placed in a golden reliquary and buried separately in Brittany. A small rebellion against being owned, and so, we leave these women queens who smiled through centuries of loneliness, betrayal, and quiet revolt. History remembers their titles, not their size. But if you listen closely, through the stone and dust, you can almost hear it. The faint rhythm of patience, the steady breath of survival. They were miserable, yes. But they endured. And sometimes, in history, endurance is the only kind of victory that lasts. Settle again. The fire has burned low. Outside the walls, history moves on without them, but inside these rooms, time feels patient. We drift now toward the forgotten sons of empire. Princes born to rule, but built to break. They were wrapped in silk, fed on gold, and raised inside cages of expectation. Every nurse, every tutor, every prayer whispered around their cradle carried the same word, king. But most of them never made it that far. Let us begin quietly, with a prince whose crown waited longer than his health could manage. Edward the Black Prince. He was England's perfect heir, tall, graceful, the warrior son of Edward III. He won battles before he could grow a beard. His armor was blackened steel, his manners soft and chivalric. People adored him. Poets compared him to a knight carved from moonlight. And yet, the story bends as softly as his body did. Years of war and illness hollowed him out. The bright young general faded into a frail shadow. By 35, he was too weak to stand without help. He spent his last years watching the kingdom from his bedchamber, whispering orders through fever. He never became king. When he died, the crown passed to his 10-year-old son, the future Richard II, who inherited not his father's glory, only his loneliness. Let us move across the sea, to France. A place where royal bloodlines tangled like ivy, and health was a constant disappointment. Charles VI of France. They called him Charles the Beloved before his mind began to unravel. After that, he became Charles the Mad. He was a gentle boy, soft-voiced, courteous. He married a Bavarian princess who loved him sincerely, a rare gift for any king. But madness crept into his mind like winter fog. One day, while riding with his knights, he suddenly drew his sword and attacked them, convinced they were traitors. He killed several before collapsing, trembling, crying that he didn't know who he was. From then on, he lived between delusion and lucidity. Sometimes, he forgot his wife and children. Other times, he refused to bathe because he believed he was made of glass and might shatter. His courtiers padded the walls with cloth, and the queen managed the realm. He survived for decades, fragile, flickering, surrounded by doctors who didn't understand what they were watching. History calls him tragic, but in a quieter way. He was also peaceful, the only king in France who truly believed he was transparent. Let us float east, towards Spain, where the royal gene pool had begun to resemble a closed pond. Charles II of Spain. The final Habsburg. The last chapter of a family that loved itself too much, quite literally. He was born misshapen, sickly, and alarmingly pale. His jaw jutted so far forward that he could barely chew. He drooled constantly. He didn't speak until the age of 4, didn't walk until 8, and spent most of his life surrounded by priests and physicians who treated him like a divine experiment. His court called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. They blamed demons for his illness, never his family tree. Charles adored the idea of kingship but was too weak to exercise it. He prayed, signed papers with shaking hands, and believed every misfortune was a curse sent by his dead ancestors. He died at 38, childless, jaw slack, the weight of an empire resting on bones too thin to hold it. With him, the Habsburg dynasty collapsed, undone not by war, but by genetics and denial. Let us move north again, to Denmark, where melancholy was practically an heirloom. Prince Christian of Denmark, later King Christian VII, was born with all the right titles and none of the right stability. His childhood was a study in cruelty. Servants teased him for sport. Tutors beat him for fidgeting. When he became king, he was little more than a frightened child inside an adult's body. He danced through corridors alone. He played with knives, giggling. He performed mock executions on his servants, then wept. The court physicians called him eccentric. Modern doctors would call it schizophrenia. His wife, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, tried to help him. She found comfort instead in his physician, Johann Struensee. Their affair became a scandal, and Struensee was executed. Caroline was exiled. Christian lived on, isolated, babbling to invisible courtiers, a puppet on his own throne. He ruled for 40 years, though he never truly reigned. His signature was used on laws he couldn't comprehend. When he died, it was said the bells of Copenhagen rang politely out of habit, not affection. Now, let us drift toward Russia. To the frozen palaces where princes were born already watched by suspicion. Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, the last heir of the Romanovs. He was born in 1904, small, pale, and precious. The empire rejoiced, but his parents soon learned that the boy carried hemophilia, the royal curse. A simple bruise could end him. His mother, Alexandra, believed it was punishment for pride. His father, Nicholas II, refused to discuss it. They hid his illness, wrapping his childhood in silence. Every game, every stumble was terror. Blood beneath the skin was their secret enemy. And then came Rasputin, the strange monk whose calm voice seemed to stop Alexei's bleeding. The family clung to him like a spell. It was superstition, medicine, and desperation blended together. When the revolution came, Alexei was 13. He spent his last months imprisoned with his family, sick and confused, still asking if he might go outside to play. He never did. His life ended in a basement in Ekaterinburg, quietly erased, as if history itself was embarrassed by its own cruelty. And so we leave these princes' bright names on fragile paper. Men raised to believe the world would bend for them, only to find that their bodies, their minds, or their bloodlines would not. Some went mad. Some wasted away. Some never even had the chance to fail properly. History calls them weak. But perhaps weakness is simply what happens when the crown grows heavier than the head beneath it. The kings who reigned are remembered in stone. The princes who didn't are remembered in silence. And sometimes, silence tells the truer story. Let us settle back in. The fire is nearly ash now. The night feels longer than it should, and so did their reigns. These were the women who refused to fade, queens who outlived husbands, lovers, children, and rivals. They ruled through funerals, letters, and ghosts. They smiled in portraits that were painted long after joy had left them. Power can be a kind of survival. But survival has its own quiet cost. Let us begin with a queen who wore grief like jewelry: black pearls, black veils, black eyes that never forgot. Mary I of England, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She waited through 20 years of humiliation to sit on her father's throne. When she finally did, England was tired of blood and religion. But Mary had waited too long to be gentle. She burned Protestants. She re-established the Catholic Church. She believed she was healing the kingdom. History named her Bloody Mary. In truth, she was a lonely, frightened woman, desperate for meaning. She loved her husband Philip of Spain with all the hunger of someone who'd never been loved back. He stayed in England just long enough to conceive an heir, or so she thought. Her belly swelled. Doctors congratulated her. Prayers were said. But there was no child, only a phantom pregnancy. She waited, and waited, and waited. When she finally realized the truth, she stopped eating. She died at 42, whispering Philip's name. He did not come to her funeral. Now, let us drift south to Spain, where another widow turned her grief into legend. Juana of Castile. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Her husband, Philip the Handsome, was everything his name promised. Golden hair, laughing eyes, charm like perfume. Juana adored him, perhaps too much. When he died suddenly, her mind folded in on itself. She refused to bury him. She traveled across Spain with his coffin, opening it at night to kiss his face. The smell was unbearable. She said love was stronger than decay. The courtiers said madness had taken her. For 46 years, she was kept locked in a convent. The queen in name, a widow in spirit, a prisoner in practice. When she finally died, her son Emperor Charles V said a short prayer and moved on. History called her crazy. But maybe she was just the last person in Europe still capable of feeling anything at all. Let us move to Austria now. To a queen whose smile never reached her eyes. Empress Maria Theresa. Mother of 16. Ruler of half of Europe. A woman who balanced diplomacy, childbirth, and grief as if they were items on a daily checklist. She buried 5 children before they were grown. She fought wars while pregnant. She married her daughters off like chess pieces. One of them, Marie Antoinette, would lose her head in Paris. Maria Theresa ruled for 40 years. She woke before dawn, prayed, wrote letters, signed decrees, and inspected soldiers with an expression that could freeze rain. When her husband died, she dressed in mourning and never wore color again. For 15 years, she lived surrounded by portraits, ghosts, and paperwork. When death finally came, she told her confessor, "You see, I am just a poor sinner. It was true, but only technically. Let us float gently north again. To a woman who reigned so long that no one could remember England without her. Queen Victoria, the grandmother of Europe. She began as a shy girl who didn't expect the crown. She ended as a monument, a marble figure wearing eternal black. She married Prince Albert, and for once, it was genuine affection. He organized her letters, corrected her grammar, and ran the empire while she smiled and signed. When he died, she stopped smiling altogether. The rest of her life became a ritual of mourning. Black dresses, black curtains, black carriages. She even had her servants lay out fresh clothes for Albert each morning as if he might return. For 40 years, she ruled from behind a veil. Her ministers learned to speak softly around her. Her children avoided mentioning happiness in her presence. When she finally died in 1901, the empire was relieved, not because they disliked her but because it was exhausting to live in someone else's grief for that long. And then, there was Catherine the Great, Russia's longest ruling empress. A German princess who decided she could do the job better than her husband and was correct. She seized power after he drank too much and alienated everyone around him. He died soon after, officially of complications. Catherine never looked back. She read Voltaire, built palaces, collected art, and corresponded with philosophers who thought she was enlightened. She also crushed revolts, censored newspapers, and maintained an empire through charm and fear in equal measure. She outlived her lovers, her critics, and her reputation. When she died at 67, she was still writing policy notes and designing gardens. Russia mourned her like a grandmother, stern, clever, occasionally cruel, and utterly irreplaceable. And finally, one more queen. Not the greatest, nor the worst, but the most human. Anne of Great Britain. Last of the Stuarts. She spent her life trying to produce an heir. 17 pregnancies. All ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or early death. She buried children so often she stopped naming them aloud. By the time she became queen, she was swollen with gout and grief. She ruled from her bed, signing papers between doses of laudanum. Her courtiers whispered. Her legs were so inflamed she could barely move. She wept constantly, though no one knew whether from pain or sorrow. When she died in 1714, the crown passed to a distant German cousin. No husband, no child, no dynasty. Only silence and the faint scent of lavender, which she had ordered to be burned daily to cover the smell of illness. These were the queens who would not die when the world wanted them to. They lingered, ruling through loss, sustained by duty, habit, or pride. They outlasted enemies, children, and the memory of laughter. History remembers them as powerful. But perhaps their true strength was endurance, the kind that leaves you hollow, yet standing. They were not monsters or saints. Just survivors who forgot how to stop surviving. Hey guys! Tonight, we're stepping into the lace-trimmed, corset-squeezed, fainting couch-filled world of the Victorian era, a place where everything looked prim, proper, and tastefully covered in dust. So, dim the lights, sink into whatever you're lying on, and get comfortable. Because tonight, we're going to talk about something the Victorians absolutely did not want to talk about. Pregnancy. Yes, the one thing that every generation needs to keep existing, and yet somehow, in 19th century Britain, was treated like an unspeakable scandal. You could have 10 children, but heaven forbid anyone noticed you were ever pregnant. It was as if babies just magically appeared one day, delivered by a polite stork wearing a cravat. So, let us gently drift back to that time, the mid-1800s, when Queen Victoria was still scribbling in her diary about how disgusting childbirth was, and when a woman showing a hint of belly was considered nearly as offensive as showing her ankles. The Victorian world was obsessed with appearances, not truth, not comfort, not reality. Just appearances. And for women, especially the respectable kind, that meant maintaining a kind of porcelain purity at all times. Pregnancy was physical proof that one had, well, engaged in an activity best not mentioned at tea. Even married women were expected to handle it all discreetly, which is a very polite way of saying, hide your body and pretend nothing's happening. There were euphemisms, of course. Endless ones. You weren't pregnant. You were in a delicate condition. Or expecting a happy event. Or sometimes just indisposed, which could mean anything from a mild headache to being 7 months along. And if you were unmarried and found yourself in a delicate condition, well, you were in for a delicate disaster. Because Victorian society didn't just frown on illegitimate pregnancy. It basically erased the women it happened to. Families disowned daughters, employers dismissed servants, and newspapers used moralistic language like fallen woman, as if gravity itself had a strict moral code. So, how did women, especially ordinary women, not royal ones, hide pregnancy? The short answer, with ingenuity, layers of clothing, and a lot of quiet panic. Victorian fashion, for all its discomforts, did offer one advantage: volume. Women were buried under mountains of fabric chemises, corsets, crinolines, bustles, and layers upon layers of skirts. For most of the 19th century, dresses were designed to conceal the body's natural shape entirely. The fashionable silhouette involved a narrow waist but wide, bell-shaped skirts which, conveniently, created room underneath. If a woman adjusted her corset a little looser and wore an extra petticoat or two, she could sometimes disguise a pregnancy for quite a while. Especially if she stayed indoors, as many did. The classic confined to bed with nerves excuse worked wonders for avoiding social appearances. Of course, corsets were both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they held everything in place literally and could delay visible signs for months. On the other, they were, corsets. Rigid, boned, and capable of making a pregnant woman faint just by breathing too deeply. Some doctors even warned that tight lacing during pregnancy could lead to miscarriage or deformities, though the Victorians, being the Victorians, often responded with, "Yes, but think of the waistline." Servants had an especially hard time. Domestic service was one of the most common jobs for working-class women, and it came with strict rules about morality. If a maid became pregnant out of wedlock, she was usually dismissed immediately. No references, no severance pay, just out. And since she lived where she worked, that meant instant homelessness. So many resorted to desperate measures to conceal the truth. Some bound their bodies tightly with cloth or wore oversized aprons to disguise their shape. Others strategically timed visits to the countryside to care for sick relatives, which, of course, were relatives who conveniently didn't exist. Middle and upper class women, on the other hand, had more privacy and more access to respectable hiding tactics. Many would simply retreat from public view, citing vague illnesses. The genteel phrase was going into confinement. Around the 7th month, they disappear into their homes or a relative's estate, have the baby quietly, and then reappear months later as if nothing had happened, sometimes presenting the newborn as a new niece or a friend's child. The lengths people went to maintain appearances could be absurd. One notable example comes from Victorian novels themselves, which, despite being obsessed with morality, often hinted at how people maneuvered around it. Writers like Thomas Hardy and Elizabeth Gaskell drew on real social behavior when they wrote about fallen women. Characters like Tess Bayfield or Esther Summerson mirrored the quiet, lonely struggles of women forced to hide what society refused to acknowledge. And then there was the clothing industry, which, being the opportunistic entity it always is, found ways to help. Maternity wear did exist, but you'd never call it that out loud. There were discreet advertisements for adjustable gowns or expanding bodices in women's magazines, phrased so delicately you might think they were selling curtains. Let's take a slow drift through the wardrobe. Imagine a typical dress from the 1850s. A fitted bodice with a high neckline, long sleeves, and a skirt so wide it could easily hide a small table. The waist was often high, just below the bust, a style revived from the Regency era which conveniently left room below. By the 1860s and 70s, crinolines gave way to bustles, moving the fullness to the back. That didn't help much if your belly was the problem, but resourceful women found ways to shift padding or use darker fabrics with patterns that disguised curves. You could also strategically place shawls, capes, or the ever-useful folded fan while sitting. And when fashion couldn't help, there were props. Baskets, books, cloaks, anything to carry or drape in front of oneself. One social historian even noted that women would stand behind furniture in portraits if they were pregnant, not because it was improper to show, but because it was improper to acknowledge. But of course, not every pregnancy could be hidden forever. For many unmarried women, discovery led to ruin. Some ended up in Magdalene asylums, grim institutions meant to reform so-called fallen women through laundry labor and prayer. These were less about compassion and more about containment, society's way of sweeping its discomfort under the rug. Others gave birth in secret and placed their babies in foundling hospitals or with wet nurses. The Foundling Hospital in London, for instance, accepted infants anonymously. Mothers would often leave a small token, like a ribbon or button, in case they ever wanted to reclaim the child. Most never did. And yet, through all of this repression and silence, the Victorians managed to keep up their favorite pastime, judging each other. Pregnant women were scolded for showing too much, while barren women were pitied or whispered about. It was a lose-lose situation neatly wrapped in lace. Even Queen Victoria herself had a complicated relationship with pregnancy. She had 9 children, but her diaries make it clear she found the whole process an inconvenience and an animal thing. Which, considering she was the most visible woman in the empire, didn't exactly help normalize the experience. The ideal woman, according to Victorian values, was pure, delicate, and paradoxically fertile, but not visibly so. It was as if the body's natural functions were an embarrassment to civilization. And so, society built a kind of collective fiction. Women simply glided from marriage to motherhood without the messy, biological in-between. Let us float over to another corner of that world, the working class. For factory girls, mill workers, and domestic servants, hiding a pregnancy wasn't about social shame, it was about survival. Missing work meant losing income. And many employers didn't need much excuse to replace them. Some women continued working right up until labor, then took a few days, sometimes just hours, to recover before returning. They'd leave the newborn in the care of neighbors or relatives, or, tragically often, with paid baby farmers, women who offered to care for infants for a small fee. Many of those operations were neglectful, even deadly. The grim economics of the time created an entire shadow world of hidden pregnancies and quiet tragedies, all while the respectable classes busied themselves writing essays about morality. So, to answer the question plainly, how did ordinary women hide pregnancies in Victorian times? With fabric, silence, fear, and an astonishing amount of improvisation. It wasn't just about disguising a bump. It was about surviving in a culture that wanted to pretend female biology didn't exist. And somehow, through all the corsets, shame, and euphemisms, life continued. Babies were born. Mothers healed in secret. And society went right on pretending it hadn't noticed. Let us stay here for a moment in that dimly lit parlor of hypocrisy and perfumed repression, because the story isn't done yet. Welcome back. Still awake, good, or at least, comfortably half asleep. Tonight, we keep gliding through the lace-curtained silence of the Victorian age, where everyone knew everything but pretended to know nothing. In this world, a hidden pregnancy wasn't just a woman's secret, it was a community project. A delicate dance of discretion involving doctors, midwives, neighbors, and, occasionally, very nosy landladies. Because while the Victorians publicly shamed fallen women, they were also masters of quietly helping them out behind closed doors, of course, and only if everyone agreed never to mention it again. Let us start with the midwives. In the 19th century, midwives occupied a strange position, part healer, part gossip, part secret keeper. They were usually older women, practical, discreet, and experienced in matters that polite society refused to discuss. If a young woman in trouble came to them unmarried, frightened, and desperate, a good midwife could be her only ally. She'd help her through the pregnancy, sometimes arranging for her to stay in a distant village or a rented room under a false name. Payment was often small, sometimes just food or favors. The important thing was silence. Midwives knew how to make things look respectable. They could write letters for a woman, invent cover stories, or even disguise the timing of a birth to match a marriage that hadn't quite overlapped neatly enough. And when things went wrong, as they often did, without modern medicine, they were the ones who quietly handled it. No police, no doctor, no questions. Just a whispered prayer and a buried memory. Doctors were trickier. Officially, they were men of science and morality. Unofficially, many of them were just as pragmatic as the midwives. Some refused to treat unmarried pregnant women, claiming moral duty. Others, more understanding or more cynical, treated them discreetly, sometimes under another patient's name. The Victorians had this odd obsession with delicacy. A man of medicine might deliver a baby but still refuse to say the word pregnant. They used terms like the patient's condition or a certain situation. There's even a record of a London physician, around 1870, who would visit unmarried expectant women at night, entering through the servant's entrance to avoid scandal. He billed his services not as obstetric care, but as general assistance, which, in the coded language of the time, basically meant, I want to tell if you want to. Then there were the neighbors. In working class neighborhoods, everyone knew everyone's business. Privacy was a luxury. You could hear arguments, smell the cooking, and notice when someone started wearing looser dresses. But that didn't always mean exposure. Communities, especially among the poor, often practiced a kind of practical compassion. They gossip, yes, but they also quietly help. If a girl was in trouble, someone might lend her money, or help her move, or watch her other children when the time came. It wasn't generosity, it was survival. Everyone knew that today's scandal could be tomorrow's sympathy. Now, let us gently drift up a rung or two on the social ladder to the middle class, where reputation was everything. For these women, pregnancy outside of marriage was not just embarrassing, it was social death. So entire networks of respectable secrecy evolved to manage it. There were lying-in houses, discreet establishments that specialized in hosting pregnant women for the final months. Some were reputable maternity homes. Others were little more than commercial cover operations, run by midwives or retired nurses. You'd check in under an assumed name, give birth, and either take the baby home or leave it behind. Sometimes the birth would be recorded under another woman's name entirely. A married sister, perhaps. Or a sympathetic aunt. The paper trail or lack thereof was part of the disguise. And occasionally, families themselves became accomplices. A wayward daughter would be sent abroad for her health. When she returned, the household had mysteriously acquired a ward or adopted niece. It was all terribly tragic, of course, but handled with impeccable manners. If that sounds like something out of a Victorian novel, that's because it was. Writers of the time were obsessed with these quiet social scandals. Not because they wanted to expose them, but because they revealed how deeply everyone lived in denial. Charles Dickens, for instance, wrote about fallen women with both moral judgment and sympathy. He even helped fund a home for repentant girls, run by his friend Angela Burdett Coutts. It was supposed to reform them through discipline and honest labor, mostly laundry, naturally. Because nothing says redemption like ironing. And yet, even Dickens couldn't bring himself to write frankly about pregnancy. In his novels, babies appear as if conjured. The act of giving birth or even being visibly pregnant simply didn't happen on the page. There's a strange irony here. This was an age of medical advancement, after all. The same decades saw chloroform introduced in childbirth, antiseptic surgery pioneered, and anatomy studied more than ever before. And yet, when it came to women's bodies, the Victorians behaved as if knowledge itself were indecent. Magazines for women rarely mentioned pregnancy directly. Health guides used euphemisms so vague that they might as well have been written in code. One lady's companion from 1868 referred to childbirth as the event which concludes the mother's expectation. Which sounds less like labor and more like an estate sale. Doctors, too, walked a fine line. They published medical manuals about female anatomy, but for professionals only, of course. For the public, knowledge was sanitized, moralized, and often wrong. And yet, despite all this repression, women quietly found ways to support each other. They passed advice in whispers: what to eat, how to wrap the body, how to fake illness, when to travel. Midwives shared herbal remedies for nausea and swelling. Older women offered mother's helpers, coded little gifts like extra linens or homemade broths. Even silence could be an act of kindness. A neighbor pretending not to notice. A shopkeeper extending credit without asking questions. A friend burning a letter. These small gestures kept lives intact. Because, underneath the rigid morality, the Victorians weren't heartless. They were just trapped in a system that made truth feel dangerous. Of course, secrets can only stay hidden for so long. When an unwed pregnancy was discovered, the fallout could be brutal. Families cut ties. Churches expelled members. Employers dismissed women without references, guaranteeing they'd never work respectably again. Some sought escape in drastic ways: sudden moves to distant towns, quick marriages arranged under pressure, or, tragically, unsafe abortions. These were risky and often deadly. Abortion was illegal under the 1861 Offenses Against the Person Act, and those caught could face imprisonment. Yet historians estimate that hundreds, possibly thousands, of such procedures happened every year in secrecy, using everything from herbal concoctions to dangerous instruments. The women who performed them, often midwives or herbalists, lived in constant fear of arrest. Still, many did it. Not out of greed, but necessity. For some women, it was the only way to survive. And yet, even with all this suffering, the Victorian ideal of feminine virtue remained untouchable. Paintings, novels, and sermons kept repeating the same fantasy: the pure woman, untouched by desire, devoted only to her husband and children, though preferably never seen in the act of creating them. It's hard not to admire the commitment to denial. There's something almost poetic about a society that invented industrial steam power and railways but couldn't handle the fact that women got pregnant. So, by the end of the century, how much had changed? Not much. But cracks were beginning to show. By the 1890s, more women were entering the workforce, and early feminists started questioning the double standards. Medical education slowly opened to women, meaning that, at last, midwives and doctors could speak from experience instead of theory. The secrecy began to fade, but very slowly. As we lie here in the dim candlelight of Victorian hypocrisy, it's easy to forget how heavy that silence must have been. Every polite smile, every euphemism, every carefully tied corset, part of a vast performance meant to erase something completely natural. But beneath it, life pulsed on. Quietly, secretly, stubbornly. Because no amount of moral outrage or lace could stop the most ordinary of miracles. Welcome back. Let us keep our voices low tonight, because this part of the story is a little darker, though not in a loud or shocking way. More like the quiet darkness of a foggy London alley. The kind that muffles everything, even the sound of grief. We've already drifted through the drawing rooms and the doctor's offices. Tonight, we move into the spaces that polite society refused to look at: the shabby boarding houses, the overworked midwives' rooms, and the hidden corners where unwanted pregnancies turned into unspoken tragedies. This is the world of the baby farmers. Now, despite how it sounds, a baby farmer wasn't someone planting infants in rows. It was the term Victorians used for women, usually older, often poor, who took in infants for a fee. Sometimes it was temporary childcare. More often, it was permanent. You see, when a woman gave birth to an illegitimate child, she faced two impossible choices: keep the baby and risk total social ruin, or give it away and try to rebuild her life. Foundling hospitals were overcrowded, and adoptions were rarely formalized. So instead, many mothers turned to baby farmers, women who advertised in newspapers, often with sweetly worded promises like "a kind and respectable person will adopt your baby for a small consideration." It sounds comforting. Until you realize that small consideration was often the only payment they ever received, and the adoption was permanent, in the bleakest sense. Let us take a slow walk through this world. Picture a narrow London street, fog clinging to the cobblestones. Behind one of those plain brick facades lives a woman like Amelia Dyer, one of the most infamous baby farmers of the 19th century. She started, as many did, with good intentions or at least practical ones. She offered childcare for working mothers who couldn't manage alone. But over time, she discovered a grim efficiency. The fee she received for taking a baby was often barely enough to cover food and care. Unless, of course, she shortened the care. Dyer's crimes eventually came to light in the 1890s, when the Thames began giving up its secrets. Small bundles, wrapped in fabric, found floating near Reading. Inside were the remains of infants she'd taken in for money and then disposed of. Her case shocked the nation, partly because people had always suspected such things happened but they preferred not to know. Because knowing meant acknowledging a truth they weren't ready to face, that the moral rigidity of Victorian society didn't just shame women. It killed their children. But Amelia Dyer wasn't alone. Baby farming was a whole shadow industry, woven into the fabric of poverty. Most of the women involved weren't murderers. Many genuinely tried to care for the infants they took in. But with too many mouths to feed and too little money, neglect became inevitable. Milk was watered down. Blankets were scarce. Illness spread quickly in cramped rooms, and when the babies died as so many did, it was quietly explained as failure to thrive. Doctors rarely asked questions. Certificates were signed, and the system rolled on. It's hard to imagine a quieter tragedy. For middle-class mothers, baby farming offered a cruel kind of relief. They could hand off the evidence of their indiscretion and return to respectability. Letters were exchanged in code, payments made through intermediaries, and the infant disappeared into the fog. For the mothers, it was agony wrapped in necessity. Some never stopped wondering what became of their child. Others had to believe the baby was being raised somewhere safe because the alternative was too heavy to bear. For the farmers, it was survival. They were often widows or unmarried women themselves, scraping by in a world that offered them little else. Society looked away, and the silence deepened. If we float now toward the foundling hospitals, the picture doesn't get much brighter, but it does get more structured. The London Foundling Hospital, established long before the Victorian age, was one of the few institutions that offered official refuge for abandoned infants. Mothers could leave their babies anonymously, sometimes with a small token, a piece of cloth, a ribbon, a button, as a way of identifying the child later if circumstances improved. Those tokens are still kept in museum archives. Tiny, heartbreaking relics of mothers who hoped to come back but rarely could. The hospital itself was strict. Only certain babies were accepted, those considered innocent, meaning born to women who had fallen once, not repeatedly. Because apparently even infants had reputations to protect. Inside, conditions were better than the streets, but still grim. High infant mortality, strict discipline, and rigid schedules. It was charity, Victorian style, well-intentioned, but laced with moral superiority. For working-class mothers, there were a few alternatives. Some charitable missions provided temporary housing for unwed women. Others offered work in exchange for shelter. But every act of charity came with a sermon attached. Repentance was mandatory. Gratitude was expected. Women who sought help were required to confess their sins, promise moral reform, and often surrender their children. Their lives became lessons, examples used in sermons and pamphlets about the dangers of female impropriety. It was less about helping them, and more about warning others. And yet, somehow, amidst this suffocating morality, small acts of compassion flickered through. Some midwives quietly found loving homes for infants, matching them with childless couples who couldn't adopt formally. Some baby farmers did care, despite poverty. Some priests and doctors bent the rules to protect rather than condemn. The system was cruel, yes, but individuals within it sometimes weren't. Humanity persisted, even in the cracks. Let us drift for a moment into the quieter emotional side, the mothers themselves. Imagine the endless silence that followed childbirth in secret. The sound of a baby's cry, muffled so the neighbors wouldn't hear. The long, aching walk away from a boarding house after leaving the child behind. The letter you couldn't send. The name you couldn't give. Many of these women disappeared into history. Their stories weren't recorded, their names never printed. Victorian society preferred it that way, easier to keep the moral order intact when no one had to confront the cost. But their experiences left traces. In coroners' reports, hospital ledgers, faded advertisements in old newspapers. You can still find them, if you look closely enough, voices whispering from between the lines. By the 1890s, public outrage finally began to stir. Cases like Amelia Dyer's made headlines. Parliament debated the baby farming problem. New laws were passed to regulate adoption and childcare, slow, imperfect, but a start. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1897 required anyone taking in infants for profit to register and be inspected. It didn't end the practice, but it made it harder to hide the worst abuses. And yet, even then, the moral hypocrisy remained. Society still blamed the women, not the conditions that forced them into secrecy. Still treated pregnancy as a scandal instead of a fact. The machinery of judgment was simply too old, too polished, too well-oiled to stop overnight. But maybe the most haunting part of all this isn't the cruelty, it's the quiet. The way people whispered about fallen women while pretending not to see them. The way officials signed certificates without reading between the lines. The way mothers carried secrets to their graves, because speaking would destroy them. It's that silence, heavy, polite, suffocating, that defines the Victorian age more than its lace or manners. An entire civilization that talked endlessly about morality, while doing everything possible to avoid looking at the consequences of its own rules. So tonight, as we rest in the stillness of that era, we can imagine those forgotten women not as villains or saints, but as survivors. doing what they could with what they had, in a world that gave them almost no choices. And though their names are mostly lost, their stories shaped the quiet reforms that came after the beginnings of modern social care, maternity rights, and the slow recognition that shame doesn't prevent suffering. It just hides it. Hey again, still here, still awake or maybe pleasantly drifting, which is perfectly fine. Tonight, we're gliding out of the narrow streets and back into the chandeliered world of the Victorian upper class, where the wallpaper was imported from France, the morals were imported from the Bible, and reality was something best covered in brocade. Because yes, rich women got pregnant too. Sometimes inconveniently. Sometimes improperly. And just like everyone else, they had to hide it. They were simply better at pretending it didn't happen. You see, for the elite, secrecy wasn't just survival, it was an art form. Where a working class woman might bind her stomach with cloth and hope her employer didn't notice, a duchess could simply vanish to the countryside for her health. A letter or two sent to the newspapers about her fatigue or indisposition would explain the absence. Everyone knew what indisposed really meant, of course. But polite society functioned on a sort of mutual agreement: if you don't say it, I won't hear it. And so, from drawing rooms to estates, women disappeared into delicate silence, waited out their confinement, and returned with just the faintest air of mystery. But let us be clear, even for wealthy women, pregnancy was not something to be seen. Queen Victoria herself, despite having 9 children, set the tone for embarrassment. She referred to her own pregnancies as tiresome and dreadful, and found the whole subject disgusting. Once, she even wrote in her diary that she couldn't stand the being of a mere machine for producing children. So if the Queen was disgusted by pregnancy, imagine the ripple effect. The upper classes treated it as an unspeakable physical inconvenience, like catching a cold, only slower and more scandalous. Now, when an unmarried woman of means found herself in trouble, her options were both more luxurious and more deceitful. Families went to remarkable lengths to manage these little delicate matters. Money could buy privacy, and privacy could buy forgiveness. Let us picture this: a well-bred young woman, recently sent abroad for a season. France, Italy, Switzerland, anywhere with mountains and discretion. Officially, she was improving her health. In reality, she was improving her plausible deniability. While abroad, she'd stay with a trusted friend or distant relative, someone who understood the rules of silence. The child, when born, would be discreetly adopted out or placed in the care of a loyal servant. By the time she returned to London, she was thinner, quieter, and just a bit sadder. No one asked questions. They simply said, "How restorative the air must have been." And then there were the mistresses, the secret mothers of the aristocracy. This was the era of double standards so wide you could drive a carriage through them. A man's affair was often whispered about with amusement, his illegitimate children sometimes even acknowledged, if he was generous. But for women, one misstep could end everything. So, discreet arrangements were made. Mistresses of powerful men were often sent away during their pregnancies, given modest homes or annuities in exchange for silence. Children born of these relationships might grow up as wards, nieces, or godchildren. The fiction was flexible. Everyone involved knew the truth, but the point wasn't to lie convincingly, it was simply to keep up appearances. There are countless examples buried in aristocratic family trees, subtle clues, quiet corrections. Birth certificates that don't quite line up. Dates of marriage that seem suspiciously close to birth dates. Take the case of Lady Flora Hastings, one of Queen Victoria's own ladies-in-waiting. In 1839, she developed an abdominal swelling. The court gossips immediately assumed she was pregnant, the result, they said, of an affair with John Conroy, the Queen's mother's advisor. The scandal exploded. Victoria, who disliked both Hastings and Conroy, believed the rumor. But it wasn't pregnancy at all. Lady Flora was dying of a liver tumor. By the time the truth emerged, she was dead, and Victoria's reputation had taken a blow. The lesson was clear: in high society, even rumors of pregnancy could destroy you faster than the real thing. Let us float gently across to the continent, where things were only marginally less hypocritical. In Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, the same rules applied, only with better tailoring. Mistresses were practically part of royal life, but their pregnancies still needed to be managed. French aristocrats perfected the art of discreet childbirth. A noblewoman might disappear to a private retreat, often a convent or a countryside villa, accompanied by a single maid sworn to secrecy. The baby would be quietly placed with a foster family and sometimes adopted back years later as a distant relative. It was a social ballet of lies, all performed in the key of silence. Even legitimate wives sometimes resorted to subterfuge, not because they were hiding shame, but because they were hiding frequency. In polite circles, being visibly pregnant too often was considered, well, a bit vulgar. It suggested too much enthusiasm for one's husband. So women timed their social calendars carefully, adjusting dresses and public appearances. Portrait sittings were postponed, parties avoided, and the corset, that great instrument of denial, was once again laced just tight enough to flatten truth into fashion. Of course, not everyone managed it perfectly. There were scandals, slow-burning, whispered ones. The case of Princess Louise of Belgium is a good example. Married unhappily, she took a lover and, naturally, became pregnant. When her husband discovered it, he didn't just cast her out, he had her locked in a mental asylum. Her crime wasn't the affair itself, noblemen did that daily, but the fact that she could prove it, visibly, with a child. So while men flaunted mistresses, women were punished for biology. The double standard held steady, corseted, and ironclad. And yet, hypocrisy has a strange elegance when dressed in velvet. Drawing room conversations fluttered with gossip about wayward ladies, but no one mentioned names. Newspapers hinted at mystery confinements, careful never to violate decorum. A duke's scandal might circulate in whispers for decades without ever being printed. Even the servants, who saw everything, learned the rule: see, but do not see. It was the grand conspiracy of Victorian life, a shared illusion built on politeness, silence, and denial. Behind all the etiquette, though, the experience was the same: fear, secrecy, endurance. Whether you were a maid hiding under an apron or a duchess hiding behind a carriage curtain, the shame worked the same way. Pregnancy wasn't just physical, it was social. It marked you. And no amount of lace or lineage could erase that mark. But occasionally, the truth refused to stay hidden. There were whispered births in royal palaces, quiet payoffs, and sometimes the occasional pamphlet or memoir revealing long-kept secrets. The end of the century brought with it a hunger for scandal, a creeping fascination with the private lives of the powerful. The more society tried to suppress desire, the more it wanted to read about it. So, by the late Victorian and Edwardian years, novels and newspapers began to peel back the lace a little. Scandal sold. Fictionalized versions of aristocratic misdeeds became wildly popular because deep down, people knew the reality wasn't that far off. As we settle into the candlelight of those closing years, we can almost feel the contradictions unraveling. The corsets loosening. The whispers growing bolder. Soon enough, the 20th century would arrive, bringing war, modern medicine, and the first faint stirrings of women's autonomy. But for now, the Victorians remained suspended in their elegant web of denial. A society built on silence and running perfectly on it. You can almost feel it, the curtain beginning to lift. The long century of silence, lace, and whispered denial coming apart, thread by thread. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had changed, and so had the way people thought about women's bodies. The secret pregnancies, the vanishing daughters, the quiet confinements in countryside estates, all of it began to feel old-fashioned, even faintly absurd. But it didn't vanish overnight. No, the Victorian ghosts lingered in the tone of the newspapers, in the architecture of shame itself. The early 1900s brought something truly dangerous to the social order: information. Medicine, journalism, and photography all conspired, perhaps accidentally, to make the invisible visible. Women's magazines began to discuss health, modern motherhood, even domestic science. Of course, the language was polite, the illustrations sanitized, but the very fact that such topics were being printed at all meant the silence had cracked. At the same time, birth control pioneers began to whisper the unthinkable truth: that pregnancy could be chosen. Margaret Sanger in America. Marie Stopes in Britain. They were called radicals, immoralists, even criminals. Sanger's pamphlets were seized as obscene. Stopes was denounced from pulpits. But the seed was planted, and no amount of moral outrage could unplant it. Still, for many women, the old fears remained. In rural areas and traditional households, shame survived well into the 20th century. A woman who became pregnant outside marriage might still be sent away, only now, the cover story changed from travel abroad to visiting relatives. And the institutions evolved, too. By the 1920s, maternity homes and Magdalene laundries took the place of secret country estates. Their names were modern, their methods chillingly familiar: isolation, silence, repentance. What had once been managed by family discretion was now outsourced to religious charity. Behind walls scrubbed clean with bleach, young women gave birth in pain and anonymity. Babies vanished into adoption systems, records were falsified or destroyed. And though the corsets were gone, the control was still there, just redesigned to look righteous. But in the cities, another story was beginning. The flapper era blew through the moral cobwebs like a fresh wind. Women cut their hair, shortened their skirts, smoked in public, and laughed too loudly. It wasn't liberation yet, but it was defiance. For the first time, some women could imagine themselves as more than someone's daughter or wife. They could work. They could choose. They could, sometimes, even speak. Of course, society pushed back. Every new freedom came with its backlash. But that's the rhythm of history. Progress never walks alone, it drags resistance behind it. By the mid-century, medicine and morality collided again. The invention of reliable contraception, the pill, introduced in the 1960s, changed everything. Quietly, invisibly, it gave women something no amount of etiquette ever could: control over their own bodies. The very thing that had driven centuries of secrecy, the fear of unintended pregnancy, was now, finally, negotiable. And with control came honesty. Suddenly, conversations about sex, pregnancy, and choice began to move from whispers to print, from print to protest. The social silence cracked wider. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't universal. But the change was irreversible. In the midst of all this, historians began to look backward, to trace the old secrets, to ask the forbidden questions. Where did all those nieces and wards come from? Why were so many birth certificates misplaced? Why did so many grand houses have sealed attics and unspoken stories? The records began to talk, and what they said was often brutal. Hidden pregnancies, institutional cruelty, the weaponization of shame, it had all been there, tucked neatly behind embroidered curtains. And as the stories emerged, something astonishing happened. People didn't just gossip. They listened. The hidden girls, the silenced women, the lost children, they began to have names again. By the late 20th century, documentaries, memoirs, and novels were resurrecting these lost lives. Writers like Jean Rhys, Angela Carter, and Margaret Atwood peeled back the historical niceties and exposed the raw underside. The image of the fallen woman, once a moral warning, became instead a symbol of endurance. Museums began to archive what had once been buried. Historians pieced together midwife records, asylum logs, and family correspondence. Slowly, the ghosts were catalogued. And perhaps the most haunting discovery was this: most of these women hadn't wanted rebellion. They only wanted to live without fear. That was all. Not revolution. Just gentleness. Today, we live in a world where pregnancy announcements fill social media feeds, where baby bumps are displayed, not hidden. But underneath all that celebration, you can still feel the echo of the old silence. The need to appear perfect. The discomfort around imperfection. The ancient reflex to judge. The past is never really past. It lingers in posture, in phrases, in the way people still whisper about women's choices. Even now, when someone says a woman should have known better, that whisper carries the weight of centuries. So maybe that's why we tell these stories, not to wallow in tragedy, but to recognize the long shadow of silence. Because silence is never neutral. It always protects someone, and it's rarely the innocent. Every woman who vanished for her health, every servant dismissed in disgrace, every baby born in secrecy, they all existed. They were just erased by etiquette. And now, the least we can do is remember them clearly. You can imagine it: a quiet bedroom, long ago. Curtains drawn, a lamp burning low. A woman sitting by the window, hands resting on her stomach, afraid of what the world will say. Outside, the city hums with polite indifference. But inside, in that small, trembling space, she's part of a long, invisible lineage, the hidden mothers of history. Their stories survived in fragments, in rumors, in margins. Until now. So, if you're still listening, still drifting in this half-dreaming quiet, just know, every secret has a voice. It just waits for someone to stop whispering, and start telling.